To uphold the fundamentals of our democracy, we need to adhere to a few things. One of those things has to be that every single individual in our society needs to have the best ability to participate in that democracy. We believe that this is achieved through compulsory voting. Now, before we get into our main points about what is going wrong with our system, first of which is what's wrong with our current system, and second of which, how compulsory voting actually solves for this, let's get into our extensive model and look into exactly how we're going to do this. First of all, we're going to have mandatory voting for every single citizen between the ages of 18 to 65. If you want to vote beyond the age of 65, you are more than welcome to, but it's not going to be mandatory. The reason, the way that we're going to actually accomplish this is we're going to have voter IDs look into areas such as social security numbers, driver's license, any sort of physical document that can prove that you are who you are. That includes passports, so on and so forth. Next, we're going to have multiple days of voting rather than just one. The reason behind this is so that we can accommodate more individuals and have these individuals actually get the ability to come out and vote in whatever election that they need to, rather than forcing them to go one specific day. This allows them to get actually like days off for work, and we're going to show how this is very effective in our first point. Next, we're going to have a system of ranked voting. Currently, the voting system is yes or no. The ranked voting system allows for individuals the voting system we're going to put in is going to have a 1 to 3 choice of like how you want your vote to be cast. The first is your first priority, second priority, and third priority. The fourth position that we're going to have is a blank vote in case you don't like any of the choices and you still have the ability to cast a blank vote. Finally, the punishment that we're going to have is a punishment of community service, because we believe that voting in our society is a kind of service that we provide for democracy. So instead of having some kind of monetary monetary issue come up, especially between like lower class individuals that can't afford as much of these costs, we think giving back to the community without voting is the best way to actually like punish these individuals. And we think that the punishment goes from local elections to major like national elections, because we think voting needs to happen in every section of our society. So the punishment for local elections is not going to be as severe as the punishment for national elections, and these punishments are going to be determined by like a local judge looking into whatever needs to be done. Now let's get into the positive material about how this actually leads into the issues of our current status quo. First, let's get into the point about how leading demographics show that wealthy white people actually end up voting more than any other population in the U.S. According to CNN Money in 2018, over 80% of the voting adults from families that earn over $100,000 a year voted consistently, while just over 50% earning less than $20,000 a year casted a vote. This clearly shows a discrepancy between the areas of who is voting. And another Pew Census data shows that families making less than about $20,000 a year, only 25% of those individuals voted. The reason behind this is, one, these individuals simply don't have the time or don't care about actually voting in these societies. The issue with having so many wealthy white people vote is that demographics show that these individuals don't actually care about some of the most impactful areas of our economy and society. According to Larry Bartels of Northwestern University in his book, Perspectives of Politics, wealthy people are far less likely than non-wealthy people to actually support government spending on certain things such as healthcare, job programs, and education. And we can see that this ends up trapping the American society in a vicious cycle that only hurts the poor more and more. Because once the wealthy people just continuously get their voices heard by shutting out the people that can't afford to come to these polls, you don't get the opinions of the majority of Americans actually coming and influencing the politics that we'd like to see. Next, let's get into how active voter suppression actually occurs in our current status quo. It's become more and more difficult to vote in our society. We can look directly towards Georgia's exact match program, where individuals have to have exactly the same name on their forms of identification to actually come and vote. Even though individuals like the civil rights organizations have tried to keep governors such as Brian Kemp from voting or stopping active voter suppression, in 2018, it's still one of the most significant things that has occurred. Now let's get into our second part about how we actually get the benefits of compulsory voting, get these benefits from these issues through compulsory voting. Now, what happens when these policies actually get tackled head on? When we have more individuals from lower income societies actually come in, more minority communities and more individuals come in to vote, we see that we're going to have an increase in healthcare, like acquisitions of healthcare. We have more job programs created. We have more education funding because the individuals in these lower class societies care about that so much more than massive tax breaks that nobody else except the far wealthy care about. We can see that Trump's tax breaks, literally no one has seen like a negative, like a positive effect with that except for the ultra rich. We can see that those kinds of policies are the ones that exactly harm what we're trying to do. Let's look at the benefits that we get against voter suppression. If we look back towards every single piece of voter suppression, looking back to Alabama specifically, we see that an increased amount of voters actually leads to significant impact. According to Politico in 2018, just under 40% of individuals came out to vote in the election in 2014, but over 50% came to the midterms in 2018, causing the House to turn from Republican to Democratic. We see an active impact of what's actually going on in these societies, and we think that those links go directly back to the minority communities that it benefits and the other individuals that we can see such as lower class incomes. And because of these reasons, it's more than imperative to actually have compulsory voting be impacted in our society. Thank you. My bad.
Yeah. Sorry, and cross-ex is 4 minutes.
Okay. So 4 minutes. Okay, ready? Okay, so can you talk about the punishment for this plan you want to impose?
Okay, so the idea behind the punishment is we want to have it be community service. If it's a local election and the stakes are not as high as say like a national election, we want this community service to be a day or two versus a week or like up towards a month for like not participating in other major elections. This doesn't include the individuals that have an actual excuse, such as like medical reasons or other valid excuses for not showing up to these elections at all.
Okay, so you're saying if you don't vote in a federal election, you'll put me like, if I don't vote and I don't give a reason, you'll put me in in community service for a month.
I mean, that's one possibility. We think that like that has to do with what the like local judge decides what's going on. So if we have voter suppression, actually, like, go ahead.
So you'll have like the judges decide like what the punishment will be.
Right. 1 month is a very extreme like thing. We think like a week to like a day to a week is more reasonable.
Okay. Okay. So you talk about at the beginning of your speech, you talk about voter IDs to talk about how you're going to notify people voting.
Right.
How does this not contradict with the point you made later on about like civil rights groups talking about how voter IDs like are like disenfranchised minorities or like lower income voters?
The idea behind this is we're trying to accept as many voter ID possibilities as possible to still have individuals prove who they are versus people in like Republican like states who are actively trying to suppress voters because they don't have we don't think that that's like a major concern. We think that having individuals vote more and more actually leads to a positive turnout, as we've seen what's happened like with a 13 to 15% increase in Alabama's voting itself.
Yeah, wait, how is that ranked like choice voting though? Like that's compulsory voting. How is ranked choice voting specifically going to help turnout if you're already forcing?
Okay, right. So the thing behind ranked voting is that individuals tend to not enjoy or like the candidates that have come out so far. If they have the ability to choose, say like I want Donald Trump to be the first, but I'm okay with Hillary Clinton second and like option 3 third, it's more likely that individuals who have the majority of like number 2 votes actually get there because it's more like a reasonable or like a moderate choice because people have more choices in that case.
Wouldn't that just be for people who have multiple candidates that they like instead of just no candidates that they like? Because if I don't like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, I'm not going to vote, oh, Clinton won, like Donald Trump too. I'm going to vote like randomly because I don't care. And
no, if you don't like any candidate, that's why we have the specific blank box at the very end to allow that.
So how's ranked choice voting going to help anything if you're already forcing people to come to the polls?
Because individuals don't like exactly who they're giving. If they still want to vote and participate in the election, but have a different choice that they'd rather have, it allows for more moderate like choice and like more outspoken choice of the like society to come through. If they don't like anyone at all, they can go blank, which doesn't change anything for the worse.
Okay. So you talk about voter suppression and how this leads to like an increase. If you stop this, leads to an increase in like healthcare. Can you like give some empirics about how this is going to happen?
Well, I mean, we clearly see that if individuals who are wealthy continuously vote against healthcare, and individuals who support healthcare don't come out to vote at all. Having these individuals who come out to vote who support healthcare will end up getting healthcare into the system.
Yeah, like how has this like empirically been shown in the past? Like, do you have?
I can't give you evidence of things that haven't happened yet. This is a possible impact given by what's his name? Larry Bartels of Northwestern University in his book Perspectives of Politics. This is the ideas that he discusses.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how is multiple days of voting going to have any difference than just having an absentee ballot?
Okay, so the idea behind multiple days of voting is, say you're a lower income worker, you're working at can I finish this one? You're working at McDonald's and you don't have the ability to get the day off or the shift off. You have the ability to work with your boss or like whoever you're like talking to get a scheduled day off or like take care of your kids and get stuff scheduled so that it actually stays and like you can have a time to go and vote.
Okay. If everyone's ready. All right, so on both sides of this debate today, I think that we want the same thing. We want to have increased voter turnout, increased engagement in elections, and a more informed and democratic society. We can both agree that that's a good place to live in. The question is, how do we get there? Side government got up today and told you that they want to live in a society where everyone has the best ability to participate. We want to stress that word ability because that's what voting should be. It should be a right, and you should have the ability to exercise it. It shouldn't be a burden, and if you don't fulfill it, you should be punished. We do not believe that that is the best way to achieve the outcome that we've discussed. So where we disagree is how we can best achieve this. We think that the suggestions that side government brought up about voter ID laws, multiple days of voting, that's all fine, but really has nothing to do with what they are proposing today, which is compulsory voting, and that's what we have a problem with, this imposition of a penalty should you fail to vote. We believe that it's inherently coercive, and so let's get into that, like why we think it is coercive and it violates individual liberty and it's such a bad thing. So they propose just having community service as a punishment. But we think that you need to understand who's in a position to actually engage in this community service without it being extremely detrimental to their life. It's those same wealthy white people that they said are coming out to vote. The people that currently aren't making it out to the polls because they work 3 jobs and are a single parent. That's the person to whom a month of community service would be extremely detrimental. How are they going to afford childcare for that time that they're out picking up trash or whatever the community service is? How are they going to get time off work to do that? We think that that's a really important question, and they've really given no guidance and said that they would leave it up to local judges. We know that judges can be especially harsh towards minority communities, and we think that it's unfair to punish them with something that could be so detrimental simply for exercising the democratic right not to vote. And so that's extremely problematic. We think when you're in a position where you can't get out and achieve this community service, the next step is going to be fines, is going to be prison time, and that's extremely harmful. Further, this ranked voting thing doesn't really make sense. I think they're basing it on Australia, which is a parliamentary system. They talked about people would rank like number 1 Donald Trump, number 2 Hillary Clinton. I don't know what kind of country they think we live in that isn't so highly partisan, that people would actually like find that helpful and where that would actually increase their trust in government. And so, yeah, essentially we think it's really coercive, and if it's not coercive and they're saying there's absolutely no punishment, then they're just not going to achieve higher voter turnout, which is going to eliminate all of their impacts. So we think like implementing suggestions like the voter ID law, like the multiple days of voting, and also like we think a really good example is the method suggested in the July 2018 report by the Center for American Progress that gave a lot of suggestions that would increase voter turnout by 92 million without imposing any coercive measures. So that's would be having nationwide automatic voter registration, like in Oregon, extending the voter registration deadline to election day, having pre-registration of 16 to 17-year-olds, implementing Georgia's online voter registration plan, adopting early voting, no excuse absentee voting, Colorado's vote at home system, Virginia's policy of restoring rights to formerly incarcerated persons, civic education programs in public schools, and investing in voter engagement and outreach efforts. All of these would increase voting by almost 100 million without implementing any coercive measures. We also think we should repeal harmful voter suppression laws like the voter ID laws that they were talking about, and state laws that purge the voting rolls of individuals who have not voted in past elections. They didn't implement this in their plan, and we think it's really important. 20 million people have been eliminated from voting rolls this way. So why should you prefer this method to that presented by side government? We think 3 reasons. First, compulsory voting violates individual liberty. Second, if it is to achieve high levels of voter turnout, it will necessitate coercion, which is harmful. And lastly, compulsory voting would fail if implemented in the United States because almost 80% of the public disagrees with it and doesn't want it, and that would cause a backlash, and you would just have people soiling their ballots and not actually participating in the election. So as for violating civil liberty, Joe Carter, senior editor at the Action Institute, argues that compulsion voting violates the right to be apolitical. Annabelle Lever of the University of Manchester Law School argues that compulsory voting violates democratic principles which assume that political participation is voluntary and the right to non-participation in elections is essential to safeguarding the ideals of free expression, choice, and association. As for requiring voter government coercion, the 2018 issue of the Political Research Quarterly observes that empirical evidence demonstrates that when compulsory voting is coupled with low or no enforcement mechanisms, voter turnout rates are not any higher than under voluntary systems. So if you're going to give them the impact that they claimed of having healthcare, a better healthcare system, you need to also admit that they would have to resort to coercion. So third, compulsory voting will fail in the United States due to overwhelming public opposition. A 2017 Pew Research Center poll found 78% of the public is against mandatory voting, and so this would be extremely problematic because invalid ballots will be cast in reaction, which would render the election results essentially meaningless. Further, implementing compulsory voting in the United States will erode public confidence in the legitimacy of government. Research by Singh at the University of Georgia finds that governmental coercion to vote and associated punishments for non-voting will exacerbate the tendency of individuals who hold negative orientations towards democracy to question the legitimacy of the democratic system, its institutions, and its authorities. So what have we told you today? We have told you that we can increase voter turnout by almost 100 million without resulting in these coercive and harmful to minority policies. And for that reason, you should vote negative. Yeah, ready whenever you are.
All right. So when it comes to the idea of protest ballots and individuals who want to protest the vote itself,
Yep.
Isn't it better if we have empirical evidence of these individuals who don't like what's going on in our society?
Sorry?
So if these individuals are forced to come and vote and they put a blank on their ballot because they're not happy with any of the individuals that are up there, doesn't that show us that say 30%
Doesn't
of
not
the
voting
individuals?
show us the exact same thing?
No, because you don't know how many people are just not voting because they don't want to go to the polls, or not voting because they don't like the candidates. Because we still have not voting in our society today just because people don't want to go, correct?
And so how is that going to change our society? Having people soil ballots is going to change our society for the better. How?
Doesn't it change the narrative of the individuals who are coming up? Doesn't it allow
As if we
these
don't
individuals?
currently understand that a lot of people are feeling disenfranchised in our society. I think that people talk about low voter turnout as a direct result of people feeling disenfranchised. I don't think that would change if those people that aren't making it out to the polls soil their ballots.
Well, clearly we don't understand that in today's society since 1/3 of the nation didn't come up to vote in the last election, correct?
Right, but I'm saying that the narrative that I think is constantly talked about is that the reason for that low voter turnout is disenfranchisement. I think we understand that message as a society. I'm not sure I buy the impact will be that much greater if instead of not voting, those people soil their ballots.
Okay.
And I certainly don't know who you're saying is going to act on that and make our society a better place, because it doesn't seem like the political system is going to change as a result of that.
Well, if these individuals who are coming up to gather our votes, if they have a larger society to cater to, doesn't it mean they have to change their policies and actually cater to this larger society rather than a handful of individuals?
I think that arguing that political candidates are going to drastically change their policies is is a very tough claim to make, and frankly, you're not providing me with any empirical evidence in societies where compulsory voting has been enacted, like Australia. This hasn't happened. In fact, there's been further polarization and less trust in government.
How is that true? Recently,
That's time.
Okay.
Democracy is only as strong as the principles that it stands on. The second that those principles waver is the second that we start to lose the democracy and the principles that we hold so dear to this country. We think that the reason that America's democracy is able to function the way that it is because we're guaranteed certain rights and certain liberties. When access to these rights have been undermined, have been diluted, and have been systematically barred from certain groups, we think that there must be action that must be taken, right? We also think that certain liberties are given up to gain the benefit of the whole, right? We think that we give up our freedom to opt out of voting in order to ensure a representative government, which is one of the fundamental basics of democracy, right? We think the only way to get the best representation and the best access to this right is through compulsory voting. We think a lot of the reasons why people don't turn up to vote isn't necessarily because they have a protest vote, isn't necessarily because they don't agree with it, it's mostly because they don't have access to it, right? Or they aren't informed from it. We think this systematically happens because people aren't allowed the access to information, the access to the best way to go out and vote, right? We think that our model is the best way to enact certain, or to destroy certain barriers for certain groups, right? We hear opposition coming up here, and we hear them say that it's not necessary to have a mandatory vote because we can just enact all these different policies to increase voting. We tell you that when they say that compulsory voting isn't going to get through, half of the policies that they mention is definitely not going to get through, especially with Republicans continuously trying to block out voters, continuously trying to have voter suppression. None of the policies, none of the many handfuls of policies that they give you are going to go through. We think compulsory voting gives incentive for states to make sure that people have access to votes. The way that you make sure that people have access to votes, if you force them to vote. You can't force someone to vote if they don't have access to do it. I think this is how you can fight the barriers against them, right? So we hear a lot from Neg talking about how this is something that violates the choice of expression. We think if anything, it actually gives you more platform to express yourself. We think protest votes are growing and increasing within countries that have mandatory voting. We think it's a signal that those countries are doing something wrong. In Brazil, when you have an increase in protest votes and soil ballots, it's a show that they don't like the two options that they're stuck with, right? We think that this is an indication of that expression. We think this is something that's exacerbated on our side for the better. We think the statistic that people don't want it, statistics itself are kind of interesting because you always have to take from a small group of people. You don't always necessarily know that it's representative of the people, so don't rest your entire case on this one number that may or may not be as solid as you think it is. So going on to the idea that, going on to our first idea, so Varun kind of came up to you, my friend came up to you and told you the demographics, what it currently is, why they exist, and how we can change those with our motion. I'm going to tell you specifically what happens next. After we enact this motion and we get the benefits of more people coming out and more representation in our voters, what happens then? The impacts we get is that we think that the majority of voter and officials elected will now be more left-leaning because the entire political system will shift towards Democrats. We can make this assumption because we think that Simon Jackman, and the assistant professor at the Victoria Shook Facility Scholar, and he wrote an entire scholarly article regarding that since support for parties of the left is correlated with socioeconomic status, we think that as a socioeconomic based differentials and turnout diminish, support for parties of the left increase, right? We think that you start to see that the impacts is that as we are growing through the nation, you have the Browning effect, right? The more the generations that are starting to come up now are more people of color, more minorities, have different identities and different backgrounds and experiences that we can capture whenever we have more people mandated to come out and to vote, right? We think that to the extent that compulsory voters increase turnout, and turnout increases support for left parties and their policy agendas, as proven by Simon, then compulsory voting can be shown to have policy implications. This means it mobilizes voters who would otherwise abstain and whose preferences are on average on the left of the center. When you shift these forward, you can see in turn increased support for parties of the left that results in things like higher welfare spending, more state intervention, and more support for like more social reform, right? We think that this like increases voter participation for those who didn't have access before, right? We think that like you find by Sarah Birch, an American political scientist and academic, we think that she says, I found that the young, less knowledgeable, the poor, and those who are more detached from politics participate at roughly the same rate as their older, more knowledgeable, richer, and more engaged counterparts in countries where voting is compulsory and abstention is sanctioned. When they come up here and try to paint this scary picture of protest votes will always be like this main demographic coming out of these low-income voters, we tell you that's not true at all. They participate, according to Sarah Birch, at the same exact rate on average, right? We think like they want to be involved just as much, but because of the barriers to access, they aren't allowed to. We change that through our motion, right? So we think that the second thing that happens is you pull voters from the middle who have less extreme views, and you can pull median voters towards less extreme politics. You get more compromise and more centrist views, right? William Galston, a Brookings Institute scholar, thinks that the key to less polarization in the electorate is compulsory voting. It's the disaffected, the angry who vote. If everyone, including those in the less intense middle, voted, you would get fewer ideologues in office, right? We think that what happens is low turnout rate pushes American politics towards increased polarization. When only the people who have extreme views and who want to vote are the ones going out, you get much more polarization, you get much less compromise and reform, right? So what we tell you today overall is that the impacts of the shift towards the left and less extreme views can improve income equality. This evidence is cited specifically true because of the gap between the voters and the population as a whole. Non-voters are more often poor, young, and members of minority groups. This disconnect has a policy implication. A 2005 paper for the Inter-American Development Bank examined 91 countries from 1960 to 2000, found that strictly enforced compulsory voting improved income distribution. This is true because Dr. Rebuttal, who specializes in these development economics and public policy, shows that this is important, and this happens because you now see that a lot of people who are of the identity and background who actually experience these systematic barriers are the ones going out to try and change it. I think overall you get the benefits of the people who are harmed the most in today's world. Thank you.
No, don't worry. You were excited. Okay, ready?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just want to get into, you've talked a lot about these other ways to make voting more accessible. So why is the element of coercion necessary?
The thing is it's not really coercive, is it? Because we think that there's always a sort of punishment to certain things you don't do, but whenever you show that, when you incite the idea that there has to be a value. So
how do you define coercion if it's not the government punishing you for failure to take an action?
That's not necessarily coercion, that's just inciting that there's a value in democracy, and if you don't uphold those values.
So can you give me a definition of coercion? What policies can we call
coercion? Meaning that if you have someone who preys on different minds of other groups, I guess you could say.
Okay, definitely unclear on that, but we're gonna move on. So you've talked about this broad claim that we're gonna have less polarization in America, which sounds like a great thing, but can you give me empirical example of a country that has reduced polarization as a result of compulsory voting?
So we think that William Galston, who talked about less polarization, is the person who studied over countries that have had compulsory
voting. But he's
voting.
just theorizing. So what I'm asking is, can you give me an empirical example?
Okay, so if you look into, I think it was Australia, and they talked about how they're more uniform on gun rights and things like that. We think that that's more.
Isn't it true that Australia has just reached an all-time low in government satisfaction at only 41% and has had 22 prime ministers, has had a revolving door of prime ministers averaging 22 months?
Possibly.
So is this a society that you want to live in? Doesn't it sound more polarized?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the exact correlation to compulsory voting. There's a lot of other factors that go into dissatisfaction with the government. It doesn't have to be a result of compulsory voting.
Okay, so is there any model that we've turned to that has seen a net benefit to society because of compulsory voting?
Yeah, there's plenty of countries that have seen an increase in the effect of one, voter turnout, but two, the fact that more more people are able, especially with ranked choice voting, which we put in compulsory voting, the ability to express what they think is best.
How ranked choice voting works in a presidential system? I'm still a little unclear on that.
Right, so ranked choice voting is if you have a ballot and you get 3 or 4 options to decide who you want, the people who get the most, number 2, are most likely going to be the ones who get in, versus when you had Hillary and Trump, people either hated them or loved them. So whenever Trump got elected, half the country didn't like them.
So the United States is going to just stop being a two-party country, and our entire system of government and ideology is going to rapidly transform?
We think this is a long-term thing that can be effective, but we think, the two parties no longer have as much control because now more people can run with more chances to win.
Okay, do you think that this is going to be really effective in increasing voter turnout.
Yes.
So why is it necessary to add in the element of punishment?
We think that the only way that you can incite governments, states, and people to actually like go through with these policies is if you make it mandatory. That way they're incited to give access to votes.
Okay, and what about the impact that I brought up in my speech about like the possibility that you could be really like punishing single parents working lots of jobs and having them do a month of community service just isn't feasible, and it's going to be really detrimental to their life.
Our model very much minimalizes that chance, and
How so?
Because we give a 3-day voting versus just the 1 day that exists in the status quo.
Right, but let's say they can't vote. Let's say they don't want to vote. Let's say it's against their religious beliefs.
They have
Is it fair to have a local judge decide their punishment?
They have a none of the above option. You also, in most countries that has compulsory voting, you're allowed to submit a form that acknowledges specific like reasons and excuses as to why you
In
couldn't
any of
vote.
those countries, are you allowed to abstain because of religious reasons?
Possibly.
Which ones?
Not sure off the top of my head, but I think in America, especially when religion is so valued, it would definitely be a possibility.
So how would you prove that you get a religious exemption?
So this is a compulsory, this is a theoretical motion to where like when you implement it, you kind of decide what happens. We think that religion falls under the excuse that we told you is allowed.
Okay, so just off time, I'm going to talk about Center for American Progress and then go on to why their plan is bad. Okay. Is everybody ready? Okay. On the Center for American Progress. Remember we tell you that the negative position in today's debate is that voter turnout can be increased without government coercion. They tell you at the beginning of their speech is that they want to give people the best ability to participate. Forcing people to participate is not giving them the best ability, but adopting the plan from the Center of American Progress gives everyone the chance to participate if they want to. We propose a comprehensive plan to drastically increase voter turnout by 2 mechanisms. All 50 states should adopt the 10 recommendations proposed by the Center for American Progress. This is automatic voter registration, same-day voting on election day, re-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, online voter registration, early voting, no excuse absentee voting, vote at home with a mail ballot with the option to return a vote center, restoring rights to formerly incarcerated prisoners, implementing civic education, and investing in voter engagement and outreach. All these plans will make it very easy for people who actually want to vote to go and vote. So that when they say they're going to help people and give everyone the best ability, forcing them doesn't give them ability. Our plan is actually giving them ability without forcing them. We tell you that collectively, that these measures will collectively boost overall voting levels in the high 60% to the low 70% range. This is certainly high to solve for all the affirmative harms of low voting. In the Center for American Progress says it would lead to a more representative and responsive government. The affirmative has no good reason why it's necessary or advantageous to have voting turnout levels of 90%. Forcing everyone to vote is not desirable. The major reason people don't vote is that they don't care or they're ill-informed. Jonah Goldberg of the American Enterprise Institute rightly observes, it takes a twisted understanding of democracy to say that our politics will be greatly improved by getting more input for uninformed people. On to public opposition. We tell you our objection to compulsory voting is that it will fail in the United States to overwhelming public opposition. This point is undisputable. Every U.S. public opinion poll proves massive opposition to forced voting. 78% opposition in the Pew poll that we cited. Another survey by YouGov reporting the New York Times found that only 26% vote support for mandatory voting in the United States. The likelihood of compulsory voting being successful given this overwhelming public hostility is slim to none. 2 likely consequences will be massive backlash, resulting in a high rate of invalid ballots. Angry voters will turn in blank and spoiled ballots to signal their fury. Invalid ballots have demonstrated to be a major problem under compulsory voting. Some studies indicate that the rate of invalid ballots is high as 50%. Singh's research indicates that forcing unengaged and disaffected to vote is a major cause of invalid ballots. This problem will be magnified in the United States due to higher rates of hostility to compulsory voting than any place in the world. The second bad result will be an erosion of public support for the legitimacy of democracy, which I'll get back to later. Okay, onto their case. on like violating liberty and coercion. Our first 2 points against compulsory voting were that the Center for American Progress plan was better in that we allowed people to vote, and that there's a lot of public opposition, but also they coerce people to vote. They say coercion. They give this like weird definition of coercion, but coercion is do this or we're going to punish you. There's no question that compulsory voting violates a person's individual freedom to choose not to vote. Carter from the Action Institute says it violates a person's right to be apolitical. And Lever from the University of Manchester Law School argues that compulsory voting violates democratic principles supporting autonomy and freedom of association. They say people can go to the polls and choose not to vote, but if we give people all these easier mechanisms to vote, early voting, absentee voting, pre-registering 16 and 17-year-olds, it's very easy for anyone who wants to vote to go and vote if they choose to. We don't force people to do so, and we're not going to violate their liberty or coerce anyone. Their plan is really bad. First of all, because of public opposition, because their counter plan, our plan at the Center for American Progress gives people the ability to vote, and a lot of these plans have been done before within individual states, and since they're smaller, they're much more likely to be supported on a national scale. They say the punishment mechanism is going to be community service up to a month determined by a judge. We know because of the American legal system, this is very likely to lead to discrimination and arbitrary punishments. If judges just accept to say, oh, I think you deserve a month. Oh, I think you deserve 2 weeks. Oh, you're rich. You can pay me off. I think you deserve a day of community service. Their plan is going to lead to arbitrary punishments and isn't going to help the U.S. whatsoever. This could really harm low-income people and minorities. They're violating liberty. They say at the beginning of their case they want to give people the best ability. Our plan gives people the best ability. We don't force people to do anything. The last one is eroding legitimacy. Corrosion to votes reduces support for the legitimacy of democracy, which is really bad. Gabriela Santi-Rango, PhD at the University of Kentucky, says that Singh shows that compulsory voting is associated with decreased satisfaction with democracy. He argues this is because of external coercion by the state can be associated with decreased interest in its democratic status and lower belief in the legitimacy of the system. If the government is forcing you to go to the polls, you're not going to think that the government is democratic. You're going to feel coerced, and you're going to have much less confidence in the system you're a part of. Empirical study of youth voting proves that compulsory voting will increase resentment. This is Ben Odefield, Nottingham Trent University, 2016. Previous non-voters as well as future abstainers would likely be particularly resistant to compulsory voting. Such compulsion may actually serve to reinforce a deepening resentment rather to engage the young people in a positive manner. Remember, my partner tells you that in Australia there's increased polarization right now. Our plan, they give you these plans of ranked choice voting and say you can vote on different days. We think these are really good and we can probably implement these, but this is not coercion. All these plans that they suggest are going to increase turnout and not going to be compulsory voting. We think that this coercion is going to be really bad because it's really unpopular, which leads to backlash. It's going to undermine the legitimacy of democracy, leading to more backlash. It's violating people's liberties, and if there's one thing we care about America, it's liberty. Our plan is going to actually help people go to the polls, and we're going to keep everyone safe. Thank you. Charles?
So towards the end of your speech, you said all the things that were in our model besides the mandatory aspects were really good, and we can have those. We can probably implement those without actually forcing people. The idea that you in fact admit you can probably implement those is exactly why we need it to be mandatory. Can you explain to me how you can guarantee all the amendments that you propose that will happen to give access to voters?
So you're suggesting ranked choice voting, multiple days of voting. We're saying that part of your plan sounds like a good idea. The compulsory part is a bad idea.
Right, but would you not agree that the compulsory aspect is the only way to guarantee that states have to incentivize ways in which people can access vote? If you force people to vote, you have to give them access to vote.
I mean, you're proposing a plan that we say, within debate it's going to happen. And we're saying, we're going to implement this plan, right? And your plan of the ranked choice voting is probably a good idea, but the compulsory part is bad because it's forcing people. It's going to be really unpopular. It's going to lead to backlash and undermine democracy.
Would you not say that as a citizen we forfeit certain freedoms every day for the greater good of the nation, or for what's more beneficial for each citizen?
We sacrifice some freedoms if it's for some larger, greater good,
right?
Such as going to the military to defend the country. More people. Well, you're not giving access to any more people. We literally give you every way to make it extremely easy for people to vote. more days to vote, absentee ballots, pre-registration. If someone wants to vote, they will be able to. We give everyone every ability. You force people to, which is where we fundamentally disagree.
Right, so we
care
don't
about
think that all the
giving people
time
access, but not forcing people to
it's
vote.
not as simple as just implementing 100 different policies.
Well, it's
There's
not
also
100.
things like lack of education that
We
like
literally-
on politics.
We literally
So do
suggest
you think
within our
it's
plan.
easier to
We literally
implement-
suggest within our plan to give more civics education.
So do you think it's easier to implement like 20 different things in each state across the board or in the national level? Do you think compulsory voting, which has subsequent like you have to do certain things in order to make it successful, is more like able to
Well,
do?
we tell you, like, a lot of these plans have been implemented within states before, but compulsory voting is really unpopular. So I say our plans are much better because maybe not all of them will pass, but a lot of these have happened in the past, like happened within individual states. And compulsory voting isn't going to happen because it's so unpopular.
So you say that it's like so unpopular. Do you not think that a lot of things that happen radically are not unpopular at the beginning, but because you institute them long term, a lot of times it becomes a normal thing.
Yeah, like-
so then people get used to it.
So
and
some
it's
things
normal.
some things can be unpopular and still be good, but yours is going to lead to a lot of backlash and undermining political legitimacy, which is going to be really bad. Your benefit is going to raise the amount of people participating by maybe like 10%, and that's going to lead to like undermining legitimacy and democracy. It's going to lead to political backlash. It's going
Right,
to lead
so I
to
don't- the
like
idea-
arbitrary punishments, which is way outweighs this
The
small
idea
increase to the amount of people voting.
that it undermines the legitimacy of democracy. We explained to you that democracy only exists if people are allowed the access to these things,
And
and
we
if
give
people if you get the best representation of government.
Okay.
It only happens if you give the most people the
Yeah.
benefit. If
Yeah,
you, on
I
your
agree-
side,
I agree
people
with
can
that.
still opt out just optionally.
With our plan, we give literally everyone every ability to vote. There's nothing that there's no suppression. We stop people from doing that. We give people civics education. We allow them to vote on multiple days. We allow them like autonomous ranked choice voting. Every way people can want to vote, they have all the ability to within our plan. We just don't force them to, that's where we fundamentally disagree. The coercion leads to the backlash.
Can
it
you
leads to
explain
undermining the legitimacy of democracy.
Can you explain explicitly why this coercion is any different than how the government acts on a regular basis towards like its individuals?
How? Because it forces people into a speech act, right? If you coerce me into going into the military, it's because you're gonna it's because you need me. Because if you don't coerce us into like drafting me into the military, because we're gonna be overrun by attackers.
Do you not
coercing me
think
to
you are
vote.
allowed to
We're saying
have the option not to actually give an
That's
answer.
time.
Thank you.
should I answer or not?
No.
I'll take
Okay,
this.
you get 2 minutes prep now, right?
Yes. I'd like to start out with some rebuttal. First of all, let's get into this idea that only their system of having like multiple different avenues for making it easier to vote is the solution. We think that all of those things are great, and just like how they can have our like portions of our system be included into theirs, we think we can do the same. Having online voting and having it so much easier for these individuals to vote will be increasingly beneficial to all of these individuals. The opposition brings up this point about how forcing these individuals to take time off their busy days because they have 3 like shifts that they have to work. By implementing online voting like they suggest, we can get rid of that, like the time period that they have to go in and stand in the polls and all of that. We get the benefit on their side through like advancements in technology and through advancements in all of this. We still think that the benefits of having every single individual vote in our society outweighs all of the like legitimacy harms that they claim. Because let's talk about legitimacy for a second. They claim that this will get rid of the legitimacy of our democracy. We think that we've already gotten rid of the legitimacy of our democracy when Republicans and other individuals in our society actively go and try to gerrymander our states to get coerce themselves into those positions of power. That is what coercion is, by actually influencing and tricking people into voting for specific things. Our policy doesn't trick anyone into doing anything. We have the information laid out, and they can actively make the choice of whether they want to elect somebody into office or not. We think that is what coercion isn't. Their side actively does coercion in our society today because we still have policies like gerrymandering. We still have individuals in 2018 actively going to voter suppression. And we don't think that this is going to go away on their side, because we can see over the last 2 decades that Republicans have become more and more stringent on these policies since the 1965 Voter Registration Act. It's gotten more easier and easier and harder for these individuals to actually come through and vote because of what Republicans have done in the recent years. Let's talk about the idea that this is some kind of coercion, how we're punishing our individuals to give up their liberties and come and vote. They do that every single day when they pay taxes, when they have property taxes. They're not participating willingly in this, but it actually upholds the idea and the fundamentals of our democracy. Everyone participates and everyone gets the benefits. We're seeing nowadays not everyone is participating, and the handful that are the only ones that are getting the benefits while actively harming the low-income individuals. And let's talk about the low-income individuals for a second. These people are the ones that we want to bring this back to. We see that those are the individuals who are not voting. One, because they either don't care, they don't know enough, or they just can't go to the polls and actually get the stuff done. By having an increase in the actual time that they can do this, and by making it mandatory, individuals will actually look into what's going on. Such with all the sources that we provided and the evidence that we provided, we can see that this impactful increase actually benefits our society. With the wealthy only concentrating on their own benefit, and they're majorly being the ones that are voting for themselves, having the low income and minority individuals come in and actively participate in these things will increase the healthcare, will increase the job participation, and will increase the education, because those are the major things that affect them the most. Not Trump's major tax breaks, which we've seen the rich constantly go favor towards. Finally, let's go into this idea that if we'll have this major backlash of people not voting as much. Let's look at a Harvard scholar, Shiara Suparthi. She claims, in Australia specifically, the median number of protest and invalid votes in a society for compulsory voting, for non-compulsory voting societies, has been just around 5,000. That's stuff like the United States. These individuals have roughly 5,000 invalid votes come in. In societies that have compulsory voting, that number increases by 70 times as much, 350,000 non-compulsory votes. We don't think that 350,000 outweighs the 300 million individuals that will come in and vote because of these statistics. It just doesn't make sense that this very small portion of individuals coming through and not voting will sway the massive influx of individuals that actually will come in, because they love statistics so much. I would love to provide that Harvard scholar that actually provided these this information. Let's look at how this actually increases. 1 minute. This increases the ideas of voter suppression, right? On their side, you're still going to get the handles of voter suppression, but on our side, the idea is every single state doesn't have the ability to actually come in and stop this voter suppression. My partner brought up this idea that with forcing every single state to do this, you don't give them the option to suppress voters anymore. You don't give them the option to like restrict gerrymandering lines as much anymore, because they don't have the ability to restrict votes. Everyone has to vote, and they have to give them the ability to vote. This gets every single benefit that they want on their side and adds it to our own. This idea of coercion doesn't make sense, because we are influenced in our society and incentivized in our society to participate in our governments regularly. And we have active punishments for not participating in our government when you don't pay your taxes. We think that this is a similar policy, but we think that the punishment should be significantly less. I must have misspoke when I said a month, but in cross-examination I clearly said the majority of these cases should be between 1 day to a week at most. It doesn't make sense for it to be a month. My apologies. But if we actually look at these like statistics, we think giving back to the community with community service is the best way to do this, rather than a monetary way that gets directly out of these individuals' pockets. Thank you.
Starting your prep time.
Everyone good? Great. Okay, so I'm going to start by making this debate a lot more simple to begin with, because I think there's been a lot of discussion about these efforts to increase voter turnout, like increasing the number of days you can go, online voting, etc. But that's not what is at the crux of the debate today, because what's at the crux of the debate today is whether you should be punished for not voting. That is what the resolution is, and that is part of the plan that they're defending. The fact that they've couched it in these other efforts, we believe is really just an effort to disguise how bad that one element of their plan is, and that's what we have to focus on, because that's what is going to do the most harm. We think on both sides of the debate we've proven that you can increase voter turnout without these unnecessarily coercive means of punishment, and that is what we advocate on our side. They've talked about how, well, if you have mandatory voting, then it will follow that all these other policies are enacted, but we think you can enact those policies without achieving their harms, and we do that on our side of the house. So the question is, which method is best? A method that follows these policies to increase voter turnout but doesn't add the element of punishment, or one that does add the element of punishment? And we say that it is the former, because adding punishment is going to, number one, have a negative impact on civil liberty. We've talked about how it violates people's freedom of speech by forcing them to do a speech act. They've talked about exceptions on religious grounds, but really provided no concrete examples of how far that extends, of who gets that protection, whether you can conscientiously object, in which case we would say that if you're just giving everyone exceptions, it isn't really mandatory voting. And if it goes to the point where you're not giving everyone exceptions, then you are forcing some people to vote when it goes against their core beliefs. And we think that is against what American democracy stands for. You're going to have decreased legitimacy of government because the public is so opposed to this policy, and they are going to see it as a coercive measure by the government, which it is. It is different than paying taxes, because taxes are a part of democratic society. They've been a part of American society since it was conceived. Forcing people to vote never has been, and we would advocate never should be. And so let's get into the real harm that their punishments do. So they've said very generously that they think it should only be 1 to 2 days of community service. But they've provided no restrictions, and we don't know what local judges are going to do with that. They've said that it could be up to a month. We don't know. It could be up to a year. There's really no clear guidelines on how that's going to unfold. And we've seen that when you give judges arbitrary power to give whatever punishment they see fit, it does punish low-income and minority communities, and that's a real possibility under their plan. We think that even the possibility of that is enough to say this is not a good plan. We need to find better ways to increase voter suppression without having this really negative outcome, which is that you're going to punish people and force them to do community service based on just a judge's conception of what is right. And they've said, well, no one is actually going to have to resort to this because we make voting so easy, but they are not taking into consideration that some people don't vote not because it's too hard, but because it goes against their core beliefs, or because they don't want to, or because they feel that any candidate that they support is going to enact policies that are harmful to them, and they don't want to be complicit in that system. And so we think that you have to consider that, and those people should not be punished because of those beliefs. So they've claimed kind of two impacts here. The first is that you're going to have more leftist and centrist politicians. We've seen that there's no real empirical example of this. I don't know how their kind of multi-party system in the United States emerges. That's a really radical claim to make. I don't know if that's going to result in more centrist policies, or it could even result in more extreme policies, as parliamentary systems have done, and increased polarization, as happened in Australia following mandatory voting. So we don't think you can really give them this benefit. And then they've also talked about how seeing how many people cast informal ballots or soil their ballots will be a good indication of public opinion. We don't think this is necessary because we have things like polls. We know Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were the two least popular presidential candidates in history. We don't need to enact mandatory voting to tell us this. And that is why we think that you don't give them either of those impacts, which means there's nothing positive that we gain from punishing people for not voting. But what we do get is we get a lot of harms. We get a more coercive government. We still have a system where gerrymandering and things like that exist. In fact, that's a big reason why people don't vote. They don't feel like their voice is being heard because of policies like that, because of policies like the Electoral College. That doesn't change under their system. All they will do is force those people that feel disenfranchised to scratch a big X over their ballot and turn it in as a soiled ballot in protest, which does not do any good for anyone. And in fact, if people do feel like demonstrating their opposition and casting a protest ballot, they can do that under the status quo. People that really passionately feel that is something they want to do. We're not saying that they can't do that. We're simply saying that they shouldn't have to in order to avoid something like community service. So you don't give them either of these impacts, and what you do get is that really bad harm of a more coercive government in a more undemocratic society, because people's right to not vote is being infringed upon, and a more angry and disenfranchised public because the government has enacted a policy that is so opposed in the public. And what you get on our side of the house is all of their advantages without any of the harms, and it is for that reason that you should vote negative. Thank you.